Morning, this is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton, Arkansas, with your morning devotion taken from the book of Deuteronomy chapter 9. In this chapter we find that Moses continues to address the nation of Israel prior to them entering into the promised land, and in this chapter he tells them the reason and the motivation for why they're going to be allowed to enter in. The chapter is actually broken into two parts. One, it talks about the promise of God to deliver the people into the promised land. But then two, he goes back and he brings back an experience from when they had 40 years earlier molded a golden calf and worshipped it in the place of God as Moses was up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments from God. Moses continues to address the Israelites, and he continues to do this over a period of several chapters because it's like kind of layering it in, if you would, before they get ready to go in. He reminds them that the enemy that they're going to have to face in verse 2, when they go into the land of the promised land, are going to be the same enemy that they saw there 40 years earlier when they went in and spied out the land and came back and gave the negative report. So their problem didn't go away. In fact, their problem was still waiting for them there. The only difference is that God had given them a promise, and it was going to be on the basis of his ability, not on the basis of their inability. You remember back 40 years ago, whenever it was that God had picked out 12 spies and that they went in and 10 of them came back and gave an unfavorable report. And it broke the hearts of the people, and the people began to wail and to weep and just to cry out unto God, why did you bring us here? Why didn't you just leave us in Egypt where we would die instead of having us caught here outside the promised land? And again, the people tried to take the promised land by their intuition and by their force, and we know that they got beat back by some of the same enemy that are mentioned here in chapter 9. And so here they are again, and they're going to go in and confront the same people, which the Bible and history tells us they were about 9 feet tall. Goliath was probably a descendant of these people. They were strong and they were tall. They had fortified cities with the walls reaching to the heavens. And so they were a pretty formidable force to go up against. But yet God was going to go before them. And this time the people were going to follow God as he went in before them to defeat them. Now, Moses had to remind them of what God was going to do in order to condition them to be prepared for when the Lord led them into the promised land. He gave them 5 things that he said he would do in verses 2 through 3. He said that he would go ahead of them. He said he would devour the enemy with a fire. He said that he would destroy the enemy, that he would subdue the enemy, and that he will make it so that you could drive them out quickly. Now, these are all things in verses 2 through 3 that God promised that he would do with regards to this enemy that seemed insurmountable, but yet in the eyes of God, he could just blow them away with the breath from his nostril. And it was all on the basis of what? And this is a critical point for us to understand. In verse 3, the latter part, it's all based on the promise of God. God did what he did in allowing the nation of Israel to go into the promised land, and God went before them to defeat the enemy because he had made a promise to the to the previous generations. He had made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now God was going to deliver on this promise in spite of the sins of the people who he was going to give the land to. God did it mainly to drive out the wickedness that was in the nation, what would become called the promised land. Now here's the challenge. In verse 4, it speaks to the attitude of the Israelites that were going to inherit the promised land. After the Lord has driven them out today, the Bible warns them and says, do not say, the Lord did this because of my righteousness. The Lord did not drive the inhabitants of the land out because of the righteousness of Israel, because Israel was not righteous. He drove them out because of the condition of the wickedness of the people that were living in the land that he was going to give to the nation of Israel. And God knew that a stiff-necked people like the nation of Israel commingled with the wickedness of the people that currently possessed the land was a dangerous combination that would not lead to good results. The reason that the people were conquered in the land was because of their wickedness. The unrighteousness of the nation of Israel would be dealt with later. But God did it based on the promise that he had given to Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, that he would bring the people into a promised land, but he also had to deal with the wickedness of the people that were there. He goes on in verse 5 and he warns the nation of Israel, don't say it's because of your righteousness. And also he says, don't say it's because of your integrity, because they were a people that lacked integrity. But yet, in spite of their unrighteousness, in spite of their lack of integrity, God was bound to his promise, and it was time for him to deliver on that promise, no matter whether or not the people spiritually were ready for it or not. God was going to do his part. There is an expectation here that when God does his part, we should be doing our part. And even if we're not doing our part, it is not going to stop God from doing what he promised to do, because then he would become like us in unrighteousness and a person or a people lacking integrity. It was because of the wickedness of the inhabitants of the land, and that is what God fixed his target on when he went in to destroy them, to drive them out from the land so that he could put his people in the land. Why was it not on their righteousness? Well, when you take a look at verse 22 of chapter 9, you begin to get some insight. Actually, beginning at verse 6, Moses called them a stiff-necked people. A stiff-necked people is a reference to an animal whose neck would stiffen whenever they tried to put it in the yoke in order to harness it up to pull the plow. Well, God was comparing his people to a stiff-necked animal who would not be compliant to put their neck into the plow and be submissive in order to do the work. And so that was God's reference point to what this people was like, at least as far as their attitude. They were non-compliant. They were not willing to participate. They were not willing to do the work, and they were living a defiant lifestyle. They were a stiff-necked people. That's why God couldn't go in there and claim the land on the basis of the righteousness of his people. What kind of bragging room would he have in the world to hold them up and say, I drove out these people and gave this land to these people because they were such good people? No, they weren't. They were people that were a work under development. And just like us today, sometimes God will fulfill his promise even if we're in a state of unwickedness or in a state of wickedness, not because we deserve to be rewarded, but because God values his word so much that when he promises to do something, he's going to do it in spite of the condition of the one whom he's doing it for. The second reason is in verse 22, why was it not on their righteousness? Well, they were a stiff-necked people in verse 6. Number 2 is verse 22. He reminded them of the golden calf and 3 other times that God was made angry by their actions. And this was still looming. The effects of that was still out there. Verse 23, they did not trust, nor did they obey the Lord. And then their righteousness was a self-righteousness. I guess I got to beg the question, why would God do such a great thing for such an unrighteous people at the expense of the wicked people that were living in the land? It seems like it was the lesser of 2 evils that he was doing it for. Well, God had made a promise, and he promised that he was going to give that land to the nation of Israel. And he did it on the basis of an unconditional love, and he did it on the basis that he was going to fulfill his end of the promise to the full condition of what he had said, in spite of what the nation of Israel would be. I might even go so far as to say, why would God allow a person like me and a person like you who even knows his son as their Savior, who at times in their life fails God, why would he let us into heaven? It's because of what he promised us. Not because we can ever be scrubbed up enough, good enough, cleaned up enough, washed enough, righteous enough to go to heaven, because we can't, because we're sinners. But God allowed us to enter the promised land on the basis of his promise that said, if you accept my son as your Savior, you can go to heaven. And so God allowed the nation of Israel to go in, and he drove out the wicked individuals so as to purge the land, if you would, to give the Israelites the best opportunity possible. It was because of his promise that he would drive out the wicked. God would not let his people slide on their unrighteousness. He would still hold them accountable, and he would still set the expectations that they were to live up to, and he gave them his promise that he would hold them accountable and he would discipline them should they fail him. God had to purge the land of the wicked before he could give the self-righteous people their land, all in the hopes they would act responsibly with the opportunity that God had given them. So to make it personal, let me ask you this. What has God given you that you didn't deserve to get on the basis of your own unrighteousness, but yet God promised that he would give it to you, and he has fulfilled his promise. And are you, when God has fulfilled his promise, trying to take credit for it yourself by saying, well, it's because of a righteous people that God has done this? Or was it because God was purging out the enemy before you to place you in an opportunity to do something wonderful and great and give God the glory and the credit, recognizing that our righteousness is as filthy rags? Pray that you get a blessing out of this today. And I just pray that as we go forward into the day, as God delivers on his promises to us, that we realize and not take credit for ourselves, but we would give all the glory to a God who fulfills and lives up to his promises.